Bullied girl's shocking revenge that changed everything, incredible transformation story. A story by Heartfelt Tales. It all started on a rainy Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where even the sun refused to show its face, hiding behind thick gray clouds as if it sensed something was about to go terribly wrong. In the quiet town of Elms Ridge, at the corner of Rosewood Avenue, stood Whitmore High School, an ordinary building with extraordinary secrets. And on that particular day, those secrets were about to unfold in the cruelest of ways, targeting the one girl no one thought would ever stand up for herself. Her name was Elise. 16 years old. Petite, soft-spoken, always tucked away in the farthest desk of every classroom like she was trying to disappear. Her long brown hair often covered her face, and she spoke so softly that even teachers leaned in just to catch her words. She wasn't popular. She didn't have loud friends or flashy clothes. But what she did have, though buried deep inside, was a quiet storm, waiting. A storm no one saw coming. Elise had been different since childhood. While other kids played tag during recess, she sat under the old oak tree with her sketchbook, drawing elaborate castles and mythical creatures that lived only in her imagination. Her mother often worried about her daughter's solitude, but Elise's father understood. "She's not lonely," he would say, watching his daughter carefully shade the wings of a dragon. "She's just living in a bigger world than the rest of us." That world became her refuge when middle school hit like a freight train. The transition from elementary's protective bubble to the harsh reality of adolescent hierarchy was brutal. Elise discovered that being different wasn't celebrated, it was weaponized. Her quiet nature, once seen as thoughtful, became a target. Her artistic talents, once praised by teachers, were mocked by classmates who called her drawings weird and creepy. By the time she reached Whitmore High, Elise had perfected the art of invisibility. She mapped out routes through hallways that avoided the popular kids' territories. She timed her bathroom breaks for when classes were in session. She ate lunch in the library, claiming she needed to study, when really she just needed to breathe without feeling a dozen pairs of judging eyes. But high school isn't kind to those who don't fit the mold. And for bullies like Mason, Brett, and Kyle, the self-proclaimed kings of the hallway, Elise's silence made her an easy target. Mason Hartwell was the worst of them. Golden boy on the outside, star quarterback, honor roll student, the kind of kid parents pointed to and said, "Why can't you be more like him?" But beneath that polished exterior lurked something dark. He had learned early that power meant never showing weakness, and in his twisted logic, tormenting someone like Elise was just another way to prove his dominance. Brett and Kyle were his loyal followers, desperate to bask in his reflected glory. Brett, tall and lanky with a cruel laugh that could cut glass. Kyle, shorter but meaner, the kind of kid who pulled wings off flies when no one was looking. Together, they formed a toxic triangle that made Elise's life a living nightmare. They called her names, Mouse, Mute Girl, and worse. They mocked her stutter, the one that appeared whenever she was nervous, which was constantly around them. Drew cartoons of her on the whiteboard when the teacher wasn't looking, exaggerated features that made the whole class laugh. Tossed her books across the classroom floor for laughs, watching as she scrambled to collect her scattered notes and drawings. Each humiliation chipped away at her spirit, and no one, not a single teacher or fellow student, stepped in to stop it. The teachers saw it, of course. How could they not? But Elise never complained, never reported it, so they convinced themselves it wasn't that serious. "Kids will be kids," Mrs. Henderson would mutter when she witnessed Mason accidentally bump into Elise's desk, sending her art supplies clattering to the floor. "She needs to learn to stand up for herself." That was the world Elise knew. Cold. Cruel. Lonely. She began to believe she deserved it somehow, that this was simply her role in the grand theater of high school. The victim. The outcast. The girl who would graduate without anyone remembering her name. But nothing compared to what they did that day in the art room. It was just after lunch on that gray Tuesday. The cafeteria had been particularly brutal. Mason's crew had staged an elaborate accident that resulted in chocolate milk being spilled all over Elise's only good sweater. She'd spent her lunch period in the bathroom, scrubbing at the stain with paper towels and fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. Afterward, she had stayed behind in the art room to finish an extra credit project, hoping the quiet of the empty classroom would give her peace. Mr. Davidson, the art teacher, was the only adult in the building who seemed to truly see her, not as a problem to be managed or ignored, but as a person with talent and worth. He had encouraged this project, a mixed-media piece about transformation, telling her she had real artistic vision. The classroom smelled of paint and possibility, walls covered with student artwork in various stages of completion. Elise found solace here among the creative chaos, surrounded by evidence that beauty could exist even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of Whitmore High. She was carefully adding details to a butterfly emerging from its cocoon when she heard the soft click of the door. She didn't notice Mason and his crew slip in until it was too late. The door clicked shut behind them, and that same sickening grin spread across Mason's face, the one that meant trouble. "Hey, little mouse," Mason sneered, circling her like a predator. "Still painting flowers no one will ever see?" The three boys moved with practiced coordination, like wolves who had done this before. Elise's heart began to race, that familiar flutter of panic rising in her chest. She looked toward the door, but Kyle had positioned himself there, arms crossed, blocking her escape. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't done anything to you." "That's the problem," Brett said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You never do anything. You just sit there, taking up space, being pathetic. We thought maybe we could help you become more interesting." Before she could respond, before she could even think to scream, Brett grabbed her wrists. His grip was iron-strong from years of wrestling practice. Kyle pulled out duct tape from his backpack, something he'd clearly brought with a plan. The silver tape caught the harsh classroom lighting as he unwound it with deliberate slowness. Elise's heart raced. She tried to pull away, but Brett's grip tightened. She opened her mouth to scream, but Mason clamped his hand over it, his palm tasting of salt and cruelty. "Shoo," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "No one's going to hear you anyway. Mrs. Peterson's got her choir kids practicing next door. They're doing that loud gospel number, remember?" Indeed, the sound of 30 teenage voices belting out, "Amazing Grace," filtered through the thin walls, drowning out any sound Elise might make. She felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. They tied her to the chair with cruel precision, wrapping tape around her arms and legs until she couldn't move. Kyle secured her ankles to the chair legs while Brett bound her wrists behind the backrest. The tape was tight, cutting into her skin, leaving red marks that would last for days. Her paintbrush was snatched from her hand and replaced by their permanent markers. Laughing, they began to scribble all over her arms, her face, her neck. Ugly words. Cruel jokes. Doodles meant to shame and humiliate. "Loser," across her forehead in red marker. "Nobody cares," down her left arm in black. Brett drew crude pictures on her neck while Kyle added mathematical equations that spelled out insults when read correctly. They worked like artists themselves, terrible artists creating a masterpiece of humiliation. "You always wanted to be noticed, right?" Brett chuckled as he drew a mustache on her cheek. "Now you're art, baby. Living, breathing artwork." Tears streamed down her face, smearing some of the ink into ugly streaks. She felt helpless, frozen, like a butterfly pinned to a board. She could hardly breathe through her panic, her chest tight with fear and rage and overwhelming sadness. But something in her, something long buried under years of silence and submission, began to crack. Maybe it was the years of being silenced, or the ache of loneliness that had become her constant companion, or the cruel ink sinking into her skin like a tattoo of shame. But as Mason took out his phone to document their masterpiece, Elise's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, she wasn't the mouse anymore. "This is going to be legendary," Mason said, holding up his phone. "Wait until everyone sees quiet little Elise covered in." They made one mistake. In their arrogance, they had focused more on their cruel artistry than on the practical matter of restraint. The tape around her right wrist, twisted awkwardly behind the chair, had loosened as she struggled. Brett, so focused on his artwork, hadn't noticed her subtle movements as she worked her hand free millimeter by millimeter. And as they turned to pose for Mason's photo, congratulating themselves on their cruelty, Elise yanked hard. Once. Twice. Then with a third sharp jerk, fueled by pure desperation, the tape on her right wrist gave way completely. The feeling of freedom was electric. Her hand was free, then her other wrist as she frantically unwound the tape. Her legs took longer, but her fingers worked with desperate efficiency. The boys were still laughing, still posing, when she finally stood. The chair clattered behind her, metal scraping against linoleum. The sound made them turn, their faces shifting from triumph to confusion to something that might have been fear. Her body shook with adrenaline, but she held the thick black marker Mason had dropped on the floor. Her fingers wrapped around it like it was Excalibur itself. And then, without a word, she lunged, not in fear this time, but with a quiet fury that had been building for years. She marked them back. One by one. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't curse or threaten. She drew. With the same careful precision they had used on her, she began to write their truth. Across Mason's pristine Letterman jacket, she scrawled the word "coward" in bold, angry letters. The permanent ink soaked into the expensive fabric, staining not just the jacket but his reputation. Brett tried to grab her, but she was smaller, faster, fueled by righteous anger. Across his forehead, she wrote "bully" in shaky but determined strokes. Kyle stumbled backward, finally understanding that their victim had become something else entirely. But Elise stepped forward with newfound confidence and marked his chest with the word "shame," the letters bleeding through his white t-shirt like blood through bandages. The boys didn't know how to respond. Their laughter died. Their cocky grins faded. They had never considered what would happen if their victim fought back, if the mouse decided to roar. Elise's trembling hands held firm as the storm behind her eyes finally broke free. And then she looked each of them in the eye, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time, and said, clear and calm, "Now everyone will see you the way I see you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like a curse. For the first time in years, Elise felt powerful. Not because she had hurt them, though she had, but because she had finally found her voice. She walked out of that classroom, face still stained with their words but no longer afraid. The hallway fell silent as students turned, gasping, some even pointing and laughing at the sight of the three boys stumbling out behind her, marked like graffiti walls, their reputations as ruined as their clothes. But Elise didn't run. She didn't hide in the bathroom or flee to the library. Instead, she walked straight down the main hallway, her head held high for the first time in years. Students parted before her like the Red Sea, whispering and staring, but she felt their eyes differently now. Not with shame, but with something approaching pride. She walked straight to the principal's office and told everything. Principal Martinez had seen a lot in his 20-year career, but nothing quite like the small girl who walked into his office that afternoon, ink-stained and fierce, ready to finally break her silence. He listened as she told her story, not just about that day, but about years of torment, of teachers who looked away, of a system that had failed her completely. The fallout was swift and decisive. The school couldn't ignore it anymore, not with evidence literally written across the perpetrators' faces and bodies. With witness statements from students who finally felt safe to speak up, and Elise's own courageous testimony, the investigation moved quickly. Mason, Brett, and Kyle were suspended immediately. A formal investigation began that would eventually lead to their expulsion. Teachers who'd turned blind eyes were reprimanded, forced to undergo training about recognizing and addressing bullying. The entire school culture was put under scrutiny. And Elise? She became the voice for every quiet student too afraid to speak. Her story spread through the school like wildfire, then beyond to social media and local news. Students who had once ignored her now stopped to talk. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner, for being bystanders to her suffering. Others opened up about their own pain, their own experiences with bullying and isolation. Elise didn't become popular overnight. But she became something far more powerful, respected, heard, seen. The girl who had spent years trying to disappear had become impossible to ignore. She started a small support group for bullied students, called the Quiet Strength. Every week they met in the same art room where she had once been tied to a chair, transforming the space from a site of trauma into a sanctuary of healing. They talked. They painted. They created art that told their stories, their struggles, their victories. And Elise? She kept drawing. But now, her art told stories, of courage, of survival, of breaking free from the chains others had tried to bind her with. Her butterfly piece, completed in the weeks after the incident, became the centerpiece of her portfolio. It showed not just transformation, but triumph, a creature emerging not just from its cocoon, but from darkness into light. Her work was entered into local exhibitions, and her story was featured in the town newspaper under the headline, "Finding Voice Through Art, Local Students Stand Against Bullying." She spoke at assemblies, sharing her experience and encouraging other students to find their own strength. Sometimes, people asked her how she found the courage to fight back, how she transformed from victim to survivor to advocate. Her answer was always the same. They tried to make me a joke. But I decided to write my own ending. The scars faded, but the strength remained. Elise graduated as valedictorian, her acceptance speech focusing not on academic achievement but on the power of finding your voice. She went on to study art therapy, determined to help others heal through creative expression. Years later, when she returned to Whitmore High as a guest speaker, she stood in that same art room, now renamed the Quiet Strength Studio, in honor of her group, and looked out at faces both familiar and new. Some were confident, some scared, all searching for their place in the world. Your voice matters, she told them, her words carrying the weight of experience and the lightness of hope. Even when it shakes. Especially when it shakes. The story of Elise became legend at Whitmore High, passed down from class to class like folklore. But more than that, it became a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it draws. Sometimes it simply refuses to stay silent anymore. And in a world that often tries to silence the different, the quiet, the vulnerable, Elise's story stands as a testament to the power that lives within us all, waiting, patient as a storm cloud, for the moment when we finally decide to let it rain. If Elise's story moved you, if you've ever felt small, unheard, or broken, know this, you are not alone. Sometimes, the quietest voice can roar the loudest when it finally speaks. And every scar, every mark, tells a story of survival. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced something similar? How did you rise above it? Share your story below. And if this video inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heartfelt Tales for more powerful stories that remind us of the strength hidden inside us all. Until next time, stay strong, and never be afraid to stand tall, even when your voice shakes.